Hello everyone, this is InDesign 1, Week 15, Webcast 1. This week, Webcast will be about threading text. So we're extending our focus from last week on working with multiple pages and then talking about how do we thread text across either multiple text frames or multiple pages. So this first webcast is just a quick introduction, and as we have seen in past webcasts, when we are dealing with a subject that we are going to spend quite a bit of time with, the beginning or very first webcast, you are probably familiar with many of the facts that I'm going to convey, but I want to be sure that everybody is at the same place and understands all the beginning parts so that we can move forward to some more difficult, maybe not necessarily difficult, more complex features about threading text. And I love this feature in InDesign. It's so consistent, so dependable, and it's so powerful. It's just one of the things that I use on a daily basis, and I'm always happy that InDesign deals with this topic very well. So before we get into the details about what a threaded text frame looks like, I just want to say a few words about a common workflow best practice, and you're going to find this is very typical out there in the world of InDesign and jobs. You as the person who is putting together an InDesign project, you will usually find that you will only type in very small amounts of information. So for example, I might type in a heading or call out, but anything from a paragraph upwards, I almost always place that text. I import it from some word processing program. And the reason for this is even if it's one paragraph, I don't want to introduce any typos. And it's very easy when you are rushing, trying to get a project done, to introduce typos. So whenever I can copy and paste, that's what I do. Because I know that the source that I'm getting that text from, in most cases, is an editor or a writer or a marketing professional who has had the text approved through several people. And in fact, when I am getting feedback, a lot of my clients put the feedback in comments in a PDF file so that we no longer fax information back and forth. I even copy the information out of the notes and paste it directly into the InDesign file or any other application I'm working with. And again, because I want to be sure that what they are giving me is exactly what ends up in the document. There are enough things that can go wrong with formatting and accidentally hitting a backspace key over a piece of punctuation or a word. That's bad enough, but I want to be sure that as much as I can, I'm sticking to exactly what was given to me. Now, if you are the person who is writing and editing, then of course you have your choice what application you want to use. You may decide that you want to write and edit inside of InDesign so that it's already there. But most editors, writers, and contributors are not going to have access to InDesign. That's not the case for everyone, but in most cases you'll find that they are going to be working in Microsoft Word. So we get that information by using the same command that we use the importing graphics command, which is File, Place. Same exact command I use for both graphics and for text. And I know you guys know this already. So what are the things that you're going to need to do to create and set up the stage so that you can import text through multiple text frames and pages? And you're going to need to do this in this week's lab because you're going to take last week's lab, save it as lab 14, and you're going to add threaded text through over a couple of pages. So the first thing that you need to do is set up either a set of master pages that will have the appropriate number of columns set up, or maybe even set up text frames ahead of time. For a document that is not going to be running text from page to page, maybe you're going to have one small text box up in a corner on one page, and maybe you're going to have half a page down below. if you know that the design is going to be choppy like that, something like a, I don't know, a brochure, you might have a better idea of where the text is going to go if you block that out or you mock it up with placeholder text. And then when the real text comes in, you have that flexibility to, well, you have the speed to use what you've already laid out, but then you also have that flexibility to modify things on the fly if need be. And if you need to have text frames that are going to thread from one to the other, you don't necessarily have to set that up ahead of time for like a brochure, but definitely for a longer document, a report, a proposal, a book, you're going to want to set up a master page that can accept that type of information on its corresponding body page and work very efficiently. And we're going to go into a lot of detail on that. Probably more than you normally would because with another teacher, just because that's what I do on a daily basis. I work with long documents, and I just think it's so important to have this skill. All right, so let's talk about some of the language involved with threaded text frames. First of all, what does threaded mean? Threaded means that text from one text frame is connected to another text frame. So let me just move down here. I have a story that's starting on this page, but if I look down at the next page, it continues. And the beauty about threaded text frames, and which is why you always want to use them with longer text, is that there is always going to be an edit somewhere. So for example, let's say somebody cuts out this first sentence here. They decide that this isn't necessary for the document. If this was not threaded to the next page, I would have to manually go get that text on the next page, cut it, and paste it onto this page so that I would fill up this text frame. By connecting it, by threading it, as I'm sure you all are aware, if I delete this text that's highlighted, it's going to just pull that text up from the next page. So let's take a look at the last few words on this page. And it says, but rest for the. If I hit my backspace key now, deleting this sentence, I can see that the text that I had, if I could find it here, here it is, but rest for the night, is 4 lines higher than it was before, 4 or 5 lines higher, because it has permission with the threaded text frame to take that text from the remainder of the story and fill it in. Now it works the other way, obviously, as well. If I add a sentence, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste that back in, whoops, I guess not. Oh, right, because I hit my backspace key, so let me just undo it. If I paste that back in, notice that the text has gone back down to the bottom of this text frame, and the rest of that text, let me let this refresh here, is now back on the following page. The term for a threaded group of text frames is called a story. This was one aspect of InDesign that I really had difficulty with when I first started using InDesign, because I just didn't associate the word story with a set of threaded text frames. So for some of you that just may not mean something, but that's what they call it. And it's going to be very important because when you do a spell check, a find and change, any of those commands that will help you find something in a document are always going to ask you, do you want this to be restricted to a story, which is going to be this one text frame if I'm in this text frame. And let me just do that. Let me bring up spelling, check spelling. By default, InDesign is only going to search the story, which means that all the other pages in this document are not going to be spell checked. Only this story, because this is the beginning and the end of this particular text flow. To change that, I would need to choose Document. And that means that whether this document is a one-page document or whether it's a 100-page document, it's going to check all of the pages, all of the text frames that are included in this particular file. Let's close out of this. So one of the things that I do when I get an InDesign file from someone and I'm not quite sure what is linked and what's not linked, and of course I have other clues to what is linked and what's not linked, but one of the first things I'll just start doing is I click anywhere in the text and I press on the PC Control-A or on the Mac Command-A. As you probably know, that command is Select All. When your cursor is in a text frame and you have the Type tool depressed, you have an insertion point blinking, that means that it's going to select all the text in a story in a set of linked text frames. So if I press Control-A or Command-A, I'm going to zoom out here, I can see that the only text that's selected is what's in this one text frame. So that immediately tells me that this is it. This isn't linked to any other text frame. And yet if I move down and I click in this story down here and I press Control-A, I can see that there are several text frames linked. And that Select All command is going to select everything in that flow. And I call it a single flow. Sometimes people will also refer to it that way. It's also referred to as a flow in other applications. So whether it's a story or a single flow, you'll hear that language. But if you're going to be looking up any information in online help or in any InDesign documentation, the word story will be associated with that. What is non-intuitive about this, as far as I'm concerned, is that a story, that means if I'm following this definition that I just gave you all, is that this little call out is one story. This headline is a single story. This other call out here is a single story. Because if it's not linked to any other text box, it in itself is a story. So we have multiple stories in this one file, even though the file is only, what do I have? I only have 6 pages of text here, not even 6 pages. But there are at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories in this file. If I wanted to put some placeholder text in either a set of linked text boxes or even in just a single text box, I want to remind everyone about the command that I find absolutely indispensable, and that is the command for putting in fake Latin. And you do that just by creating a text box, going to the Type menu, and choosing Fill with Placeholder Text. And it doesn't matter whether it's a single text box or a series of linked text boxes, it's going to fill up all the available space with exactly as much text as it takes to fill it up. One of the nice things about using placeholder text, and I've mentioned this in previous webcasts, is that number one, it tends to force a client who's evaluating a layout to not focus on the text. Unless you are converting a sample, an existing sample document. So for instance, let's say that you've been hired to redesign a data sheet, and they already have 2,000 data sheets out there. You can say, I need an existing data sheet to have an idea of what types of information is in it, and I do this all the time when I'm designing book templates. I'll say, can I have a manual? And in the process of redesigning, I take the existing manual and I convert it. But if this is something that they have never created before, then many designers and production artists will fill the text, the areas designed for text, with this type of placeholder text. Because it never fails that someone who is very technical, an engineer or a programmer, will look at the text and get distracted by the fake content if they can read it. I don't know why that is, but that's the way it seems like it happens. But if it's fake Latin, they tune out and they start focusing on the actual layout. the font, the leading, and all those things that make up the look and feel of a document. But this is completely a decision you make on a client-by-client basis, and it's a very personal thing how you want to handle it and what your experience has shown you. But this is a great feature that InDesign offers us. And I know whenever I teach a class on text flow, I always fill a text box. I change the size of the text box to something much smaller to create an overflow. Because now that same amount of text, now that it's in this text box, it's not going to automatically go away. Using placeholder text is a way to get text into a static sized frame, but now if you make that frame either smaller or larger, it's not going to adjust the text. You would have to reselect that command and fill up the new size box. So this is really handy when I'm showing people how to flow text with an overflow. But before we get into that, I want to review the parts of a text box that are associated with threading text frames. Every text frame, it doesn't matter how big it is, how small it is always going to have these two larger squares on the upper left corner and the bottom right corner. The one in the upper left corner is called the in port, and the one in the bottom right corner is called the out port. And there could potentially be lots of confusion between the out port and in port and a resize handle. But you'll notice that the programmers specifically made the in port and the out port larger to alleviate some of that confusion. Because the last thing you want to do is think that clicking on a resize handle is going to give you your text so you can move it to another area. In the last couple of versions of InDesign, the programmers or the developers have also given us lots of other really nice features, but it's cluttering up our text boxes quite a bit. One of them, as you'll remember from previous webcasts, will allow us to edit the corners of a text frame, live corners. And another one will allow you to anchor a text frame into another text frame, which we have not gotten into anchored frames. And I'm not sure if we're going to have enough time by the end of the semester to visit that, but that definitely is something that I feel is really important. So if there is time, I'm hoping next week, I'm going to fill in with a couple of little things that are my pet favorites. So we might get to visit that. In fact, I'm just kind of writing myself a note here to remind me that we have not really gone into a whole lot of discussion about this. Okay. So suffice it to say that we have a lot of icons going around the outer part of a text frame. But I think the more you work with threaded text, it's going to be really obvious that your eye's going to jump to the in port and the out port. One thing I do want to warn you about, let's take a live one. I've blown this one up a little bit so that the in port and the out port are a little more obvious. But when you look at a text frame, it's much smaller. Our resize handles are much smaller. And my zooming in will not make any difference because even if you zoom in, the in port and the out port and all the resize handles remain the exact same size as they were in the previous view. So that's not going to help. So hopefully you guys can see this. All right, let me shrink the height of this text frame to bring my point around. All right, can you see how I have my out port, which has now been turned into a overflow symbol, and my import. Now as I shrink this, I want you to watch. You see how that center resize handle is getting closer and closer to the import? At some point, the two of them are going to overlap. So now if I want to make this text box wider, I don't want to get to accidentally get the icon showing me that it's going to link this text to another object. So for instance, if I click right now on the overflow symbol, I get the rest of the text, and that's not really what I wanted. So to get rid of this, I'm going to just go over here and click on one of the tools. And I'm in a quandary. How am I going to widen this text box without first lengthening it to get that overflow symbol away from the resize handle? Typically, if you just hold your mouse down for a second before you start to move it instead of clicking. You can usually, nope, that's not working. Let me see if I can get it to go from the left side. There. I think if I didn't have an overflow symbol, it might have been a little bit more cooperative. But you can see on the left side, by holding my cursor down and then, try that again, and then dragging, I'm able to resize that. So let me use another text frame over here that doesn't have the overflow symbol. I think the overflow symbol just makes it a little bit more hypersensitive. But here's another example. I'll zoom in on this. So we can see that my resize handles on the right and the left are no longer visible. So I want to widen this text frame. If I click, it thinks that I want to link this to another text frame, and it's giving me that tool in order to do that. That's not what I want, so I'm going to click on a tool to get rid of it. Place my cursor back over the top of the out port. Hold it down and start dragging. And it cooperates, which is very nice. But I think this is one of the biggest questions that I get with text frames when people are shrinking them down to something the size of a call out and all of these symbols start overlapping. Okay, let's go back up to this other text box. I'm going to bring this back down. And let's talk about the meanings of the different versions of these icons. If an import is empty, it indicates that this is the beginning of the story. If text is linked across multiple text frames, this is the beginning. This is where it all starts. If the output is also empty, it's just a box, that indicates that this is the end of the story. It's not going anywhere else. So in this case, this is the beginning and the end of the story. And that's true for all of these text boxes here. Here's my heading. Blank box, this is the beginning and the ending. The same is true for this call out, and this is true for this call out. But now if I click on the text box at the bottom of the page, I have an open box in the top left corner, and I have a blue triangle in the bottom right corner. The triangle in the port indicates that the frame is linked to another frame, which also means that the story is going somewhere else. It's continued on another page or in another text frame. And that's why when I clicked and pressed Control or Command A, I could see that it in fact was linked to all of these other text frames. And as you know, we can, I know I've discussed this before, we can show those threads, those physical connections, the physical links, by going to the View menu, choosing Extras, and choosing Show Text Threads, which, by the way, are off by default. I believe it is, because this is a new file, and I always keep mine turned on, but I always have to turn them on manually. So now, if I zoom out, I can see a physical path of where these text frames go. And it goes, I hope, in a logical order, because it leaves this text frame, goes over to the left side, top left corner of the spread, goes through the text box. Now we're at the end of this page, and then it links to the top left corner, because in English we read from left to right, top to bottom. If you were working in InDesign in another type of language that does not follow that path, then you would link these in a different way. And the application would understand that, because InDesign not only understands different languages, but it also has, obviously, it has a program that if it's in another language, let's say it's in German, it's going to follow the rules of the German language. All right, you can see this keeps going, and it ends down here on page 6. And if I look at the bottom right-hand corner of page 6, right here in this lower corner, you can see that I have an empty output. So I know that that's it. This text is the end of the line, the end of the story. Because all these other imports and outports have blue triangles in them. As I scroll up and let this refresh, here, 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 until I get back to the very first text frame, and the very first text frame has a blank import. Now right next to this import is another symbol which should be familiar to everyone when we went into master pages and talked about that topic in some depth. This means that on a master page I created a primary text frame, and this text frame is what is the result of that primary text frame on the master page. This is the icon that is associated with that feature. And we will talk more about that and how it interacts with threaded text frames in another webcast this week. All right. Now, as you all also know, if a text frame can't hold all the text that it needs, and I'm noticing that oh great. I just got kicked. Hang on, my second computer is showing me that I just got kicked out. So I want to go back and be sure that, let me give this a few seconds to make sure that it's refreshed and that everybody is still with me. I see I have my teleconference still attached. So I am assuming that it was just my other machine. Unfortunately, I never know until I go back and have to check the recording. All right, let's continue. So if you have a text frame that cannot hold all of the text that was placed in that text frame, and it has not been linked to another text frame, or even if it has, the last text frame wasn't large enough to hold the remaining text, my output gets turned into a red plus sign, and that red plus sign means that there is overset text in the story that needs to be put in another frame. Either that, or you need to somehow edit the text down, or you need to talk to the editor, or you need to adjust the layout, because you can't just have it truncate the text right at the end. And as you also know, this red plus sign is going to cause the pre-flight, which is ongoing in the background, to give you an error message, which I'm seeing right here at the bottom of my screen. And if I hold that down and go to my pre-flight panel, and let me bring this up, it came up on my other monitor, I can see that I have one error, and that error is a text error, which you can already guess is overset text. And as I keep unrolling these triangles, I finally get down to a single text frame on page 1, which if I click, it hyperlinks to that frame, which that's what it did. So overset text turns into an error message in the pre-flight. If you know that that's the case, that you are working through layout adjustments on this, don't worry about it. I have had an overset text error in a file for weeks on end because I wasn't ready to deal with it. But just be sure that by the time you're done with this project and it's ready to go, that you have checked to be sure that you no longer have that text error. All right. Let's see, there was one other thing that just came to my head that I wanted to show you. Oh, right. Let me go over these text threads one more time. One of the things I love about InDesign, because I was a Quark instructor for years before InDesign was ever developed. And I know I've mentioned this in a previous webcast, but I feel like the developers really got it right when they gave us the clues we needed to figure out what was linked, where those links went to, and they didn't just give us these huge graphics that interfered with the flow of the document. For example, you've probably noticed that the text threads have gone away. And they've gone away not because I turned it off. The text threads have still been turned on in the View Extras See, hide text threads, that means that they're still on. But the reason I'm not seeing them is none of the text boxes in the flow, in the story, are active at the moment. But the moment I click on one of the text frames involved in a series of linked text frames, all of the threads throughout the story become visible. Pretty nice. I just think this is incredibly smart of the developers to do that. But the moment I start working on images, and this is not a text frame, by the way, this is a picture of a text frame. The moment I start working on images or I work with another text frame, all of those threads go away. So that if I zoom out a little bit and I'm trying to get the feel, I'm not being distracted by these text threads. But why are those text threads so important? And if I'm sure most of you know exactly why the text threads could be so important. This document that I have in front of you is extremely simple, right? I go from page 1 to page 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. But what if I was in a newsletter environment? Now I have a story that starts on page 1, ends on page 6. One that starts on page 2, maybe it goes to page 3, and then it jumps to the last page of the newsletter. You can imagine how confusing it's going to get trying to figure out what text boxes are linked to other text boxes. So to just kind of simulate that, I'm going to get rid of this one here. And let me copy some more text here. All right. So on a very small scale, I'm going to link this text box to this text box, to this text box, to this text box. And think of these as just being on different pages. And now the pages start getting moved around. Okay? And you're trying to figure out, with nothing selected, what the flow of these text boxes are. We can guess by looking at this overflow symbol that this is probably the last text box in the series. And I can click on these until I find one that has a white import. And I know, okay, so here's the beginning of my story, here's the end of my story. But if I didn't have these text threads showing me where this was all going, as confusing as this looks, I would have to really work to figure out where this flow went. And of course I'm simulating this by putting a pretty outrageous example up here, but I'm sure it won't take much imagination for you all to realize really how confusing this can be. And what we want to be able to do is identify these flows in a moment. I mean, just a second I want to be able to look at this and say, oh, I see what's going on. It's starting here, it's going up here, now it's going up to the right, and it's finishing up here. Because then I can undo this as quickly as I put it together. I do not know why my other computer is just not updating here. Very scary. Okay. I sure hope that your webcast is responding a little bit faster than that. All right. So there's an intro to text frames that are linked. And in the next text frame, we're going to talk about importing and threading text frames manually. There are so many different flow options for threading text frames. You have automatic, semi-automatic, you have manual, and then you have this super duper auto, which will create extra pages for you as well as create text frames. But in the last version of InDesign, Adobe introduced a new feature. Actually, they revised an old feature, and it has really changed the way I look at my workflow when I'm working with threaded text frames. So I hope I can convey this to you clearly, because you're going to have to make a choice of which is going to be the best workflow for your project at the time. All right, so we will meet again for importing and threading text frames manually. Until then, signing off.